Hey guys, welcome back to today's video, and in today's video, I'll be making a hypothetical 2028 presidential election prediction between JD Vance and Al Gore. Now, of course, JD Vance, the current vice president, requires no further introduction, but Al Gore probably does. A lot of us probably remember the 2000 election, where Al Gore famously or infamously lost that election by the skin of his teeth. He lost Florida, and by extension, the entire election by a vote of 271 to 267 in the Electoral College. A lot of people also remember that Al Gore won the popular vote by 500,000, won in a lot of swing states, again by very razor-thin margins, but lost in the state of Florida, causing him to lose the election. And of course, there's a lot of news about the issue, but now Al Gore seemingly signified that he might actually run for president in 2028. And although I think it's unlikely, it's an interesting scenario. Would someone who lost the 2000 election by 537 votes in Florida be able to win? Now, just to give a bit more context here, we know this was a very close election. This election was kind of decided by the Supreme Court. Some people argue that if the recount was allowed to continue, that perhaps Al Gore could have won. There were absentee ballots that were denied, and people said that could have made an impact. So definitely Al Gore's election back in 2000 was very controversial, especially after the fact that George W. Bush, by most accounts, was a pretty bad president. It's still widely in contention today. So could Al Gore win after 28 years since he lost the 2000 election? In today's video, I'll find out. Now, first off, I tried to find the favorability for both Al Gore and JD Vance on the same website for an apples-to-apples comparison. Now, of course, there's a lot of news on JD Vance, his favorability rating. Maybe I could have used Real Clear Politics, but because I wanted that apples-to-apples comparison, I chose to use YouGov, where JD Vance has a 39% approval and 42% disapproval rating, so roughly even, maybe slightly in the negatives. Definitely everyone knows who he is. Now we can look at Al Gore. Now Al Gore, of course, because he was the vice president 24 years ago, obviously people don't really know him as well as they do some other names. But if you look at Al Gore here, he has an 87% name recognition. He has a 39% popularity rating, which is the same as JD Vance, but his unpopularity rating is much lower at 24%. Now there's a wild card here. The neutral number is very high, and I think that a lot of these neutral people are probably Republicans, so perhaps it's closer to 50-50, but just looking at the same website, YouGov, it does seem like that Al Gore, in terms of this category, in terms of the popularity, does have some type of advantage, and it's been roughly, at about 39-40% for Al Gore, essentially ever since polling started. And if you look at JD Vance here, there's not that much, but roughly he does have a higher fame as in recognition, but his approval rating is not that great. So now let's give the safe states to both sides. Obviously, this is more vague. We don't know as much. But anyways, I'll give the safe states. I'm not going to overanalyze it because, again, the information is relatively limited. So those are the safe states here for Al Gore. For JD Vance, here we have his safe states. None of this is too surprising. Some of these states could be a little likely for both candidates, but I'm not really going to talk about it too much, just because, again, there's too much ambiguity here to really go very in-depth. Now going to the likely states, I'm going to start with JD Vance because he is currently behind. Iowa, Ohio, those are going to be likely states for sure. These are not really that competitive. South Carolina, Alaska, I think they might be about 11 to 12 for JD Vance, so barely under that safe characterization, but I would put it in the likely characterization. I think Texas, realistically, if you look at the 2000 election at the time, of course, coalitions were very different, but Bush won the state by 21%. I don't think Al Gore is someone who is too well liked in Texas. Now, Florida's a very different story. Now, obviously, I do want to first say that Texas, trends have occurred. Obviously, I don't think Gore will lose the state by 21% against Vance because of shifts, because there's more of a minority population, because there's more suburban voters who are voting Democratic. But I think that with that electoral history, Gore will not win Texas. Florida, that was the very close state back in 2000 and 2000 and a lot of the previous elections, but we know the state has shifted sadly Republican, thus the state would still go likely Republican. So Al Gore stated the reason why he lost Florida will once again go against him. Only this video will tell whether Al Gore is able to recover from that loss of Florida. Now we go to some of the other states here. Colorado, New Mexico, those are going to be Al Gore states. I'm going to give May 2nd here to JD Vance because I think that's an obvious characterization. Gore won the district, but back in 2000, but we know that coalitions are very different now and then. So now we go to Al Gore, some of his other likely states. The state of, I would say Virginia would be one of them. It voted for Harris by about 5. It's a suburban state. It's trending blue. Al Gore probably wins it. I'm thinking Minnesota as well, probably likely Democrat, as well as Maine. I'm thinking those are likely Democratic states. I think Al Gore didn't do too well in Minnesota back then, but that was because Ralph Nader took a lot of the vote, about 5%. Of course, Green voters would obviously vote for the Democrat, at least the vast majority would. You look at some of the other states here. The other state I mentioned was Maine. I think obviously Gore would still win that state, probably by about 5 to 7 percentage points. Now we go to the truly competitive ones. We're going to first get rid of Nebraska second. Now, interestingly, this would be lead Democratic, which would be a flip because at the time, the district was actually safe Republican. But we do know that the Omaha region, like geopolitics in that region has certainly shifted quite a bit, as in that was a safe Republican district under Bill Clinton, under some of the other previous candidates. But now it's a district where it's actually competitive, and in fact, leading Democratic, the opposite of Maine's 2nd district. Again, New Hampshire here, this was another reason why Al Gore lost. Al Gore predicted that he would win New Hampshire. He ended up losing it. But I think now with the coalition's different, we would see New Hampshire going into the lead Democratic characterization. So if Gore was to win the state back in 2000, he would have actually won the election. Now we go to the remaining 7 states here. First off, in the state of Nevada. Nevada, again, I believe it was a state that voted for Bush over Gore by about 3.5%. Coalitions are again very different from when it were back then to where it is now. But we see that Hispanic voters have been slightly trending away from Democrats, especially in the Clark County region. I don't know if Al Gore's going to be able to overcome that. Again, there's a lot of ambiguity here. JD Vance is not the most popular in a lot of these more urban areas with Latino voters as well. I don't know how Al Gore would perform. Right now, I would be safe here. I would probably say that it's a state. I'm not very sure. I would probably give this as. I'm very conflicted as I think that Al Gore is a relatively strong Democratic candidate based on these numbers and based on the fact that, Al Gore is someone who seemingly has a lot of grassroots support despite the fact that he's not even really related to politics anymore compared to other Democratic politicians like Gavin Newsom. I'm actually going to give the state probably to Al Gore by a tilt margin. So right now, that would be a tilting Gore state, I'd say by under a point. Arizona, obviously, at the time, coalitions were different again. Bush won the state by 6.3. Realistically, I don't think Gore will be able to win the state, just because, the state has been shifting blue, but then in 2024, Trump won the state by 5.5. It seems as though the blue shift has really stopped, or at least slowed, and the fact is, Trump is someone who's pretty unpopular here back in 2020. That's why he lost the state, became the first Democrat and Republican in the 21st century to lose Arizona. And yet, because of the border issue, Democrats lost the state. Obviously, the border issue would not be as predominant in 2028, and it would be under the Trump administration in that case, so Democrats would be hurt due to the border issue. But nevertheless, here, I do believe that Arizona, now seemingly a more conservative state, gonna go for JD Vance here. Now we go to Georgia. I don't think that Al Gore necessarily has the African-American appeal as some of the other candidates like Barack Obama or even Joe Biden back in 2020. But, it's very hard to say. Also, suburban areas have definitely been trending to the Democrats. And also the fact is that these coalitions, again, they're very different. As in, I think Al Gore, obviously back in 2000 in the 2000 election, I'm just going to pull that up. Bush won the state by 11.7%, right? If you look at this, areas like Cobb County were Bush plus 23, Gwinnett County, a county that Biden won by 20, was Bush plus 31.6. Fayette County, this was a county that was Trump plus single digits, voted for Bush by 41.1. So coalitions obviously are very different as they were compared to then. Even then, I'm not super sure of how this, how the state's gonna end up voting. I think that ultimately, though, Gore, because he's been quite distant from politics, I don't think he'll have a lot of time to campaign. I'll give the state right now to J.D. Vance, probably by a tilt margin. We go to North Carolina here. Again, I would say that similarly to Georgia, I don't necessarily think that Al Gore has sufficient African American appeal. Obviously, I don't really know, but I'm going to give the state here again to J.D. Vance. Not going to explain too much in depth because there's not really much to analyze. Also, state previously seen as a slightly blue trending state seems like it has largely stagnated. It doesn't seem like it's trending significantly Democratic, and for all those reasons, I give it to J.D. Vance. Now going to the Rust Belt, 3 states that Al Gore was able to win back in 2000 by various margins, between a 0.2% margin in Wisconsin and a 5% margin in Michigan. We're going to start here with the state of Wisconsin. Okay, so now we're finally up to the Rust Belt here, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Al Gore needs all 3 states to win, J.D. Vance only needs 1. So first off, I want to really analyze the general characteristics of the Rust Belt. It's very working class, and it's essentially an area that supported both of these candidates. In 2024, we saw that Trump won all 3 of these states, as he did in 2016. Obviously, in 2020, Trump lost all 3 states. Again, in all 3 elections, these 3 states were close. Bill Clinton, again, very similar in some ways to Al Gore in terms of the fact that, Bill Clinton was also very popular in the Rust Belt. He won states like Michigan by 13%. He also comparatively did quite well in the rural areas. I'll just click on a random state, for example, Pennsylvania. You saw that he was able to win in a county like Clinton, Pennsylvania by 11.9%. He won in Cambria by 17, right? That's unimaginable for a Democrat at this point in time. He won like Mercer by 12, right? That's something that's kind of unbelievable for a Democrat at this period of time. I'll take a look at maybe another state, for example. You could also look at, the state of Michigan. Again, you saw that Bill Clinton was able to win in a lot of rural areas. So, because he had working class appeal. Generally, vice presidents are tied to their president, although Al Gore tried to distance himself from, Bill Clinton back in 2000. Their legacies are still very tied to their president, essentially their head, and thus I would say that both these candidates have a relatively okay reputation in the Rust Belt, albeit I would say that Al Gore's approval rating is higher. All those things considered, how would I judge the 3 states? First off, in Wisconsin, Trump won the state by 0.9% back in 2024, I believe. Yeah, it was the only state that was decided by less than a point in the entire election. It's a very competitive state. There's a lot of working class voters, which in my opinion would be good news for Al Gore, just because if you click on the state, right? Obviously, most of Bill Clinton's Blue Dog coalition has now switched to voting Republican. That makes a lot of sense, but you could still see a few voters of those type of Blue Dogs who kind of at this point vote Republican, still perhaps vote for Al Gore because of the nostalgia of the previous Democratic Party. And I would say that Democrats also have the advantage because they do have a lot of the urban vote in Dade County as well as Milwaukee, and the fact that the wild counties, a very populated part of Wisconsin that are conservative, are now trending to the Democrats. Albeit, of course, Democrats don't have their Bill Clinton coalition. It does make sense that Al Gore at least has some more support in the rural areas, and it would still make sense that because J.D. Vance is the current vice president, Democrats who may not like Al Gore probably still end up voting for him. Not to mention, again, Al Gore has that kind of Bill Clinton type of tie, and I think that would help him win the state of Wisconsin. In Michigan here, again, we see a big role play here is, again, the working class voters. The reason why Donald Trump was able to win Michigan was largely because of 2 reasons. One is the Arab American vote in Wayne County, right? This county voted for Biden by like 40%, voted for Harris by under 30%. Another big reason is the working class areas. in terms of the rural areas, as well as an area like Macomb County, right? This was a county that voted for Trump by 8 in 2020, voted for Obama in both elections in 2008 and 2012, and it was an area that voted for Trump by 14. Realistically, you can see Al Gore improving in some of these areas and the rurals. I doubt he'll be really able to gain a lot of the margins in Wayne County, just because Arab Americans are like a lot of minorities, especially because of the Gaza events, moving away from the Democratic Party. However, seeing that Trump again, Trump is someone who is anti-Arab Americans, it would make sense that perhaps you could see some of these Arab Americans voting Democrat again after 2024, and all those factors considered, plus the fact that Michigan has generally voted Democratic, it has 2 Democratic senators right now. The state has a Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer, who won by 10%. Historically, Michigan has been leaning more towards the Democratic Party, albeit the state is consistently close. I would say that judging by all of those factors, it does make sense for me right now to predict the fact that, combined with the fact that J.D. Vance is not super popular in Michigan, I would have to give the state probably to Al Gore by roughly 2%. And finally, we go to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, it's very hard to call. The state voted for Al Gore back in 2000, I believe by like 2 or 3%, 4.2%. But at the time, again, coalitions are very different. Al Gore won some of these rural areas, but he lost like Chester, for example, by 10%. In 2024, we saw that, again, a big problem for Kamala Harris, a big chunk of her weakness was the more kind of working class regions. She dropped the ball in areas like Bucks County. It's historically very Democratic, has voted Democrat in every election since at least 1992, and we saw that county voted for Donald Trump. Northampton as well, historically more Democratic, as well as Monroe County, now shifting to the Republican Party. I could see Al Gore as Clinton's vice president doing better there, and we see that J.D. Vance is someone who, J.D. Vance is someone who I feel like for a lot of these voters, somewhat out of touch. Trump has that really type of populism behind him. He has the right-wing populism movement. He has a lot of grassroots support, but I feel like J.D. Vance lacks that. J.D. Vance in 2024, we know his pick as the VP was kind of like a sign of confidence for the Republican Party, as though Trump was very confident he was going to win the election. It turns out Trump was right, but in many metrics, J.D. Vance perhaps was not the most electable VP option. All of those factors considered, I would give the state overall to Al Gore by a tilt margin, because Al Gore is generally seen as a bit more popular. J.D. Vance right now is not someone who's very popular. And again, after 2 terms of Trump, even though they're not consecutive, Americans generally vote for a change. I would have to say that Al Gore is favored. A lot of this is preliminary, but I would give the election to Al Gore. Thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.